My previous video, where I outlined what I saw as the connection between the coronavirus and racism, received some very positive feedback, but also some searing backlash. And one of the most vivid examples is a text exchange I had with a very close Asian American friend, one of the most generous people I know, usually a big fan of my videos. But this Asian American friend was incensed by what I said. And here are a few excerpts. Racism is way overblown. As an Asian, this friend had been on the receiving end of racism, that African Americans are not victims and that I shouldn't be giving them this platform. Indeed, throughout our history, Asian Americans have been treated horribly many times, even massacred. Today, of course, there is stereotyping and racism against Asians. Right now, before the U.S. Supreme Court is a case alleging that Harvard University discriminates against Asians with its admissions policies, and that's been alleged against other major universities as well. So that's a huge problem. We have a racism problem, a stereotyping problem against Latinos, against Native Americans, and against all kinds of other people groups in our country. That's a national disease that we have to combat. We have to also acknowledge that by far our most severe racial problem in this country involves African Americans. As I said in my previous video, only African Americans were subjected to nearly 250 years of slavery, followed by 100 years of subjugation and abject oppression. And we are still suffering from the vestiges of that horrific racial legacy in the United States. White people bring up similar concerns, that I'm basically talking too much about race, and that that problem is largely solved, and that it's a victim mentality when African Americans highlight the issues involving race. White people need to quit deluding themselves into believing that just because we have laws banning discrimination against African Americans, racism is basically over. That's crazy talk. I don't know any intelligent white person who's honest with themselves that won't at least admit to themselves, that when they see African Americans, they generally, at least in the back of their minds, see the negative stereotypes. Hopefully, if they actually know and work with and have friends who are African Americans, they see a lot more positives. But those negative stereotypes, those horrible images that have been nurtured by white racists and the white power structure over 200 years in our country, unfortunately are there. And that does hold African American people back. In just the past few weeks, we've had some tragic situations involving African Americans in our country. Ahmaud Arbery was a jogger who was shot by two white men, one a former police officer, because they alleged he was a suspect in a string of burglaries. Turns out there hadn't been any burglaries in that neighborhood in 2 months. Breonna Taylor was in her home, completely innocent. There was a no-knock warrant from the police. It was a mistaken identity, and they shot her multiple times and killed her. We had a president of a homeowners association basically hold a delivery driver, African-American delivery driver, captive because they thought he might be a criminal. We had a Federal Express driver in a neighborhood that was accosted by a homeowner and treated like he was a marauding burglar. He had a Federal Express uniform on, a Federal Express truck. These are just a few incidents in just the past few weeks that highlight that we have a terrible problem with race in our country. The truth is, it's kind of like those home improvement shows where, they rip away the walls, they rip out the flooring, and they think they're ready to start remodeling, and they discover there are a whole lot of things buried beneath the walls and floors that they didn't even know about. That's kind of like our racial situation. Okay, we put laws on the books banning discrimination. Now we're seeing what remains about the white mindset, about structural impediments that are the vestiges of conscious racist policies that the white power structures of the past put in place. We have to acknowledge that. The great migration of African Americans from the Jim Crow South to the North that began early in the 20th century and really picked up steam after World War II was driven both by the fact that there was somewhat less racism up north than in the South, but also the availability of manufacturing jobs in those northern states. Those manufacturing plants hired African Americans, so the unions began accepting African American members. And so that was the first rung on the ladder to the middle class for countless African Americans in our country. Now, when those African Americans moved north, they were subjected to rampant housing discrimination. And that was exacerbated by our own federal government's housing programs beginning in the 1930s. And then after World War II, we had a synchronized national conspiracy to suburbanize white people and ghettoize African Americans into the inner cities. And then things really got bad late in the 1970s and into the 80s and 90s when the United States began this importing and offshoring orgy that destroyed millions of American middle-class jobs, evaporated tens of thousands of American factories. And so those African Americans, after basically one generation of having a shot at the American middle class, now were either unemployed or underemployed. So African Americans have been disproportionately negatively impacted by our horrible trade policies over the past few decades. Meanwhile, inner city youngsters, disproportionately African American, are relegated to the worst K through 12 education system in the developed world. These children didn't choose their zip codes. They didn't determine where they were going to be born and what neighborhoods they were going to live in, and yet they are tethered to these schools. The performance on standardized tests, the dropout rate, the graduation rates from high school are just atrocious for these inner city schools in every major urban area of our country. Those young African American children are going to be growing up with our children. Do we want them working with our children, building a better world, adding wealth to our country? Or do we want them to be relegated to the social welfare system and the criminal justice system, or both, which, of course, our children and grandchildren are going to have to pay for and deal with? So, of course, when you have cauldrons of privation and dysfunction in our inner cities, no good middle-class jobs, or very few of them, low incomes, poor education, high dropout rates, so you have a lot of teenagers that are not going to school and are out and about during the day. Of course, you're going to have much more crime. You're going to have much more drug abuse, alcohol abuse, domestic violence. That would be true of any people group, but that merely reinforces the stereotype and enables white people to rationalize the negative perceptions they have about African Americans. I mean, that's a terrible, vicious cycle that we have got to get over in our country. And frankly, if this were happening to white people, it would be a national catastrophe. We would not allow it to continue. As Elie Wiesel, the great human rights activist, Holocaust survivor, said, the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. And yes, while there's plenty of white hatred, white racism to go around, the vast majority of white people in this country don't hate African Americans. They are simply indifferent to the plight of African Americans. And I bring this up not just because I love black people, but because I love America. And this racial disparity, the racial divide we have in our country, is corrosive. Our enemies could not deploy a more effective weapon in our country than the racial situation that we have right now. They're laughing at us. The bastion of freedom and opportunity, the United States, has this racial problem with a huge percentage of the 40 million African Americans that live here, about the population of Canada, and a disproportionate percentage of that population is nowhere near its potential. That's just not good for our country. So this goes beyond altruism. It's practicality. We have got to do much better when it comes to bringing African Americans into the mainstream, into the middle class. What's amazing to me is, with all of the impediments that they have faced for 300 years in our country, how well African Americans have done in our country, how many have succeeded in all walks of life. It's truly inspirational, but not nearly as many African Americans are doing as well as they could be or should be because of the horrible structural impediments that we've left in place and left largely unaddressed in our country. I'm a business person. I'm focused on results, getting things done, not just making inflammatory statements. And that's why, for instance, I can't stand the term white privilege, not because it's inaccurate necessarily, but because it turns off the very white people that we have got to get focused on the issue of African American advancement. What's a better phrase? How about the white edge? I don't think there's any intelligent white person that's going to deny that white people have an edge over African Americans in our society. That's something they can buy into. Privilege, it's a loaded word. It implies that the white people are privileged. And let's face it, most white people think that they're working very hard. Many of them feel like they have had a very hard time of it and are struggling themselves, especially right now when we have 15% plus unemployment in the midst of this coronavirus crisis. So they don't like being told that they're privileged. It's just a terrible word to use. It's just not a way to win people over that we need in this battle. We have to have a plan. And the fact that our government has spent trillions of dollars over the past 60 years trying to alleviate poverty and supposedly trying to help African Americans does not mean that nothing can work just because those programs have not worked nearly as well as they were supposed to. That's kind of like saying I spent a ton of money on a quack doctor and he didn't cure me, so I guess nothing will work. Well, how about going out and getting a doctor who's not a quack? Let me lay out what some of the provisions of that plan might include. First of all, most fundamentally in our country, the right to vote. Now, there's a lot of controversy right now that some states are trying to enact mail-in voting on a large scale, or making mail-in voting the primary way of voting amid this coronavirus pandemic that we're dealing with. Of course, we have to be sensitive to potential voter fraud. When you've had so many people fight and die for the right to vote, including countless African Americans who protested, were beaten, some killed, fighting for the right to vote, we obviously don't want any legitimate voter to have their vote diluted or offset by a fraudulent vote. But we have a state, Washington State, which has a mail-in voting system on a very large scale. And I just read an article in USA Today by the Republican Secretary of State in Washington State, who praised the system, pointed out how little fraud there is, how many checks and balances that they have, and how many security provisions that they have that make that mail-in voting system viable and, if not eliminate, make fraud minimal, de minimis. Instead of the current patchwork of federal government grants to law enforcement agencies around the country that we have, some of which provide perverse incentives in terms of what police departments spend money on and what programs they undertake, let's get rid of that and create what I call the Criminal Justice Success Grants. And that means that the cities, the police departments around the country that do the best job of reducing crime, the best job of diverting young people that get in trouble from the prison track and enable them to turn their life around and avoid prison and get out of the criminal justice system, and the best job of engendering community trust, especially the minority community, and that would be based on surveys conducted by third parties. The police departments that do the best job in those crucial three areas would get a block criminal justice success grant from the federal government to use to further those programs and to enhance their law enforcement activities. That, to me, is a productive way for the federal government to help make local police departments more effective and more responsive, especially to the African American communities in those cities. Cities would compete for that. That could be marketed. That's a great way to lure business, to even increase tourism. Hey, we're a city that's a recipient of a criminal justice success grant, because that's a badge of honor. Of course, education is key. And as I mentioned earlier, the education that low-income African Americans are receiving for the most part in this country is inexcusably bad. It's awful. And we have got to turn that around, not just by improving the schools that they go to, but by creating a better environment after school and during the summer, because a huge percentage of low-income African American children in the United States live in single-mother households. They live in poverty. They live in dangerous neighborhoods. That's not a great environment to go home to after school. That's not a great way to get homework done or to be in a nurturing environment and a safe environment and to avoid bad influences. So I believe every low-income child, certainly the lowest income 10% of kids in our country, disproportionately African American and Latino, should have access to a quality, non-government after-school program and summer program. That would basically mean around 1,000 hours a year less spent in bad neighborhood situations, exposed to bad influences, and in a nurturing environment where they can learn, where they can get homework done, where they can be exposed to adults that are positive role models, good examples, people they can talk to, get counseling from, get guidance from. That's the closest we can come from a government policy point of view to replicating a middle-class lifestyle for these kids that are in these really tough, problematic neighborhoods. That will help them make much better life choices later. That will reduce teen pregnancy. That will reduce drug abuse. That will reduce crime among these children and get them on a much better track. Between equalizing funding for charter schools, creating vouchers for private and schools run by religious organizations and giving low-income kids, many more kids, access to that, and creating these crucial after-school and summer programs that will cost across the country, that will cost billions of dollars. Where do we get the money for that? Well, we get it from a wealth tax. Wait a minute, a wealth tax? That's unconstitutional. That's socialism. Hang on a second. We already have a wealth tax. You know what it's called? Local property taxes. That's a wealth tax, right? Most middle-class wealth in this country is in their home ownership. And as homeowners, we pay taxes every year on that wealth, on the value of our home. A lot of people in this country, probably most homeowners, are choking on the increases in property taxes on their homes. So here's my idea. Let's add financial securities like stocks and bonds and mutual funds to the property tax base in all of our states or our local property tax jurisdictions. Right now, there is no property tax on stocks, bonds, and mutual funds, only on homes. Does that make any sense? Wealthy people in this country, most of their wealth is not in land or homes. Most of their wealth is in those financial assets. So what I'm proposing is that every state or every property tax jurisdiction in our country have a $1 million exemption. So in other words, you have to have more than $1 million of stocks, bonds, and or mutual funds to even be hit with the tax. But for those with $1 million or more of financial assets, they would pay, let's say, a 1% property tax every year on those financial holdings. The incremental revenue from that tax on financial assets would be used for two things. One, a big chunk of it would be used to provide property tax relief to middle-class homeowners. The rest of that money, half to two-thirds of it, would be used to pay for after-school and summer programs and to equalize charter school funding, to provide access to private schools and parochial schools for the lowest income children in the community, the lowest income 10 to 15% of the kids in those communities. That's how we can make this work. That's a constitutional and locally administered wealth tax. It's a wealth tax we already have. It's just that right now, those with a lot of stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and millions of dollars worth, the top 5% of our country, they're not paying a property tax on that, but middle income tax people are paying a tax on their home every year. Let's equalize that, and let's do something that will be fairer for property taxpayers in the middle class, but also provide the additional funding to enable low-income kids to have a much better environment after school and a much better quality education at school. Let's have a program in every state where the lowest income 10% of children get free tuition to state schools if they graduate in the top third of their class and if they have no criminal history. That's a great incentive for children. I don't believe in free tuition for everybody to go to college. Let's focus on the kids most in need, and let's make sure that they're in a position to do well in college, which means, of course, that they graduate in the top third of their class. They don't get in any trouble. Those kids should get free tuition. Right now, there's no pipeline from poor neighborhoods to Silicon Valley and to high-tech jobs. No way to get there. That's why African Americans are so underrepresented at the high-tech companies in Silicon Valley. We've got to fix that. There's a lot of talk about the Department of Justice filing antitrust suits against Facebook, against Google. Well, I propose that those companies be given a safe harbor, maybe a 3-year safe harbor, renewable every 3 years, if they take dramatic steps to train young people, to give them access to education, to learning about coding, things that those children would never have access to. If Google and Facebook do that and they can demonstrate actual success, not just put some kind of program in place and give it lip service, but actually demonstrate that they're making a large impact affecting thousands or even millions of low-income kids and enabling them to have the building blocks that they need, the learning that they need to enter the high-tech workforce of our country. Give those companies a safe harbor. Don't pursue antitrust action against those companies. But again, it would be renewable every 3 years. So at the end of 3 years, if they haven't demonstrated success, they'd lose their safe harbor. If they are succeeding, this can continue. Speaking of antitrust, the federal government has given the NFL, the NBA, and in an even broader context, Major League Baseball, antitrust exemptions. All of those leagues can band together. Their owners of the teams can band together to negotiate group-wide television and media contracts. That's exempted from antitrust law. Well, why don't we have the federal government make that conditional on those leagues selling teams to groups controlled by African Americans or Latinos, and also making the capital gains tax on that sale tax exempt? So there'd be a carrot and a stick. The carrot would be that teams that are sold to groups controlled by African Americans or Latinos would be exempt from capital gains, or at least that the capital gains would be deferred if it were reinvested. And secondly, the stick would be that if they don't take action to make that happen, let's say 3 teams over the next 7 years for each of the leagues sold to minority-controlled groups. If they don't make that happen, then they lose their antitrust exemption on their negotiation of TV and media contracts. Corporations. The NFL has what they call the Rooney Rule, which the Rooney family of the owners of the Pittsburgh Steelers came up with many years ago. The Rooney Rule is that any coaching vacancy in the NFL, an African-American candidate must be interviewed. Well, why don't we have the government require that corporations have a Rooney Rule if they are going to maintain their corporation status? That is, at every executive opening, there must be an African American at least interviewed for the position. That's not a quota. That's saying let's open up the hiring process for these high-level jobs outside the circle maybe that we're used to dealing with in these companies. We say, oh my God, that's micromanaging corporations. The government shouldn't do that. Hang on a second. Corporations are not entities devised by God. Corporations are creatures of government policy. They are inventions of the government. Corporations they limit liability. Investors can't lose any more money than they put in, and they get lower tax rates than sole proprietors and other business forms do. So corporations get tremendous privileges from the federal government. Corporations, as we know them, didn't even exist when our founders put this country together. In exchange for the substantial government dispensation that corporations receive, yes, they should be required to interview African Americans for every executive position. Not necessarily hire them, but at least interview them for every executive position, just as required in the NFL when there are coaching vacancies. Getting people in the workforce, that's crucial. Getting them used to working, understanding the responsibility of working, making money, functioning in the economy. Let's induce and incent corporations to bring many, many more low-income teenagers and young people into the workforce through training, and not only train them, but hire them. Generous tax credits to make that happen. Let's create a program, much more aggressive program, to give long-term residents of public housing the ability to buy their unit, frankly, even be given the unit, provided they can maintain it and have a history of maintaining the unit that they live in. It would be better for them to own those units than for the government to own them, and that would help alleviate the huge wealth gap that we have between African Americans and white people in the United States. As much as the federal government has done for the big banks, it used to be that these big Wall Street banks were too big to fail. Now they're too bigger to fail. We actually have more concentration in the banking industry now than we did before the financial crash. The federal government has been very good to those banks. Let's get them to help get a lot more low-income African Americans into housing that they can afford and that's sustainable. That can be done. Just because we messed up subprime mortgages through sloppy administration and oversight back in the early 2000s doesn't mean that we can't come up with programs that will actually work. These banks have a ton of money. They have the capability to design financial products that can work in a wide range of situations. Let's make them do that so we can get a lot more African Americans in good housing and get them into the world of home ownership, which is such a crucial part of becoming part of the middle class of the United States. So I've outlined a broad plan for African American advancement with specific policies in a number of areas that I hope is at least a discussion starter. And of course, many other ideas can be incorporated. But the point is, as white Americans, we need to make African American advancement a priority, not just because we love our neighbor, but because it's crucial for our country to achieve its potential. We have not eradicated the virus of racism in our country, and indifference is no longer an option.